Hello and welcome to my chess channel. Today I'm going to be offering some instructional videos on how to get better at chess. I'm going to be looking at some tactics, variations, and I've got an interesting game here from 1896. Playing the white side is Dawid Markelowwicz Janowski. Playing the black side is Josef Noa. So I'm going to be explaining some of the ideas, going over a few variations, and hopefully I can offer some ideas and concepts to give you an insight into becoming a better chess player. So without further ado, let's get started. We see the first move here by white. It's the queen pawn opening, d2, d4. Playing the black side here, Mr. Noa plays e6. This could transpose into a French defense, and what you see here on the board are all opening recommendations according to the database. So anything with an arrow is a recommended move according to opening theory for both sides. c4 and d5, and this ends up turning into a sort of a queen's gambit with knight to c3. And the idea behind this is to gambit the c-pawn in order to get development for your pieces. White isn't usually too concerned with black taking this pawn, as the immediate e2, e4 is usually a good reply, and white usually has very good development, can recapture the pawn, and has developed his bishop here on either the g5 or the f4 square. Generally, you want to develop your dark squared bishop if you're playing white here on the outside of your pawn chain, but it's generally not always an option. So black plays knight to c6, and the idea is to capture the c-pawn on the next move, and then black would have two pieces attacking this d-pawn. So we see that white here defends the pawn with e2, e3. And also protects the c-pawn. Black plays bishop to b4, immediately pinning this knight here on c3. And white just completes development with knight to f3. Generally, in the opening, you're supposed to develop your knights before your bishops. However, there are always exceptions to those rules. Knight to f6, both sides completing the development with their knights. And bishop to d3. White is getting ready to castle short on the king side, and black is going to continue developing his pieces. Queen to e7. This develops the queen. Obviously, this gives ideas also for e6 to e5. White quickly castles, and black plays sort of a move which is understandable, but perhaps not the best move. Black plays bishop takes c3 here, and the reason why is black was probably concerned with white pushing this this pawn to e4 and challenging the center. So since white has control over the e4 square twice with his bishop and his knight, black tries to eliminate at least white's central control of e4 by taking on c3. So bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and also this doubles white's pawns on the c-file. So d takes c4, and bishop takes c4. And we see now that white's position has become a little bit better. We see that white now has ideas of either a2, a4, and then developing this bishop here to this square. But we see white choosing to do something different. So black castles, gets his king to safety, and then white plays queen to a4. Now what this does is this supports white's advance of the bishop to a3, which attacks the queen, and then if the queen moves, then the rook is attacked as well. So that would be a skewer. So black has to do something about that. And black just moves his rook out of the way, and which basically gets both of his pieces off that diagonal. But this allows white to develop with tempo by playing bishop to a3. And we can already feel that black's position is starting to get a little bit dubious here. White's pieces are developing very quickly, and they're developing with tempo. And anytime you can develop with tempo by attacking any of your opponent's pieces, or even undefended pieces, it's generally a good idea to do that, provided you're not creating weaknesses in your own position. So bishop to a3 attacks the queen, and queen to d8 moves it to safety. And then we see rook to b1, rook a to b1. And this adds pressure to the b7 pawn, moves his rook to the half-open file. And we can already see that black is struggling to develop correctly. Black's pieces start to get uncoordinated very quickly in this game. So knight to d5, and the threat should be obvious here. It's forking the queen and the rook here on, if knight takes c3, would be a fork. So white calmly plays queen to c2, and what this does is it defends the pawn on c3. Also eyes the h7 pawn, because the bishop will probably move back to d3, and then white should be able to have a nice game after that. So queen to f6. So we see that black has moved his queen already. That'll be the third time. He moved it to e7, moved back to d8 to get out of the fork, and then moved it to f6. So this would be an example of moving your piece too many times. The queen definitely does have to get developed, but perhaps another move to sort of lessen white's pressure on the b file would have been advisable. Perhaps maybe even rook a to b8. Rook f to e1. Now white has ideas of pushing his e-pawn forward and controlling the center, and also creating threats of e5 after he plays e4. Knight to b6. So this attacks the bishop on c4 and also lessens white's pressure on the b7 pawn. White calmly removes the threat of that attack and moves bishop to d3. And this sort of creates a battery on the b1 to h7 diagonal. So black has to do something about that. So black decides to play g7, g6. And this fixes all of black's pawns on white squares. And we'll see later on why this becomes an issue for black. Now all of these squares around black's king, these dark squares, will be weak later on. So e4, controlling the center. We see that white's definitely got some good pawns here in the center. They control a lot. And we see that black's plan of trying to develop his rook here will start to become an issue. Also, his bishop on c8 will have a difficult time trying to find employment, trying to find something constructive to do. We see that white's pieces are very well coordinated. All of them are out active doing something. This bishop on a3 is a wonderful piece, just cutting right into black's position. So black is trying to alleviate that, and he plays a move which tries to accomplish two things. Plays e6 to e5. Now this tries to activate this bishop here on the c8, h3 diagonal somewhere. Now whether it be to g4 or somewhere else, white is trying to also challenge, black is sort of trying to challenge white's center here. So e6, e5, trying to challenge white in the center and sort of activate this bishop on c8, which is the problem piece in this position. But this allows d4 to d5. Now this attacks the knight obviously on c6, and now this knight has to go somewhere. It's already becoming quite a bad piece. Moving it back to b8 looks horrible, but it might actually be a try to move back to d7 and then somewhere else after that. But we see the move knight to d8, and now this knight here on d8 really has a difficult time trying to find a good square to go to, and it's already becoming quite clear that white's pieces are quite good in this position. And we'll see how white is able to take advantage of black's inability to find good squares, good homes for his pieces. So c3, c4, and this does something which also creates many threats. Not only does it strengthen the center, it also threatens to play c4, c5 on the next move, which reinforces this rook on b1 by adding pressure to the b7 pawn. Now, even though this knight here is defending this pawn, and this bishop is, c5 definitely, black's pieces are already tripping all over each other. This knight would have to go back to d7, perhaps even to f8, and black's pieces are absolutely in need of some good squares. So black, trying to prep the advance, realizes that c5 was a threat, tries to somehow get out of the way of the attack, and moves his knight to a square which is just basically flexible. But we'll see how white is able to take advantage of this situation. Queen to d2, moving the queen over, and we'll see why all of these dark square weaknesses start coming into play, and white brilliantly takes advantage of these dark square weaknesses. b7, b6. So we see that black was still concerned with the b pawn, because these knights will probably have to move somewhere else, so this knight can't stay on d8 forever, and white needs to try to activate this bishop quite quickly. And b7, b6 also supports c5, so this knight can then move to c5, where it can attack this bishop here. Queen to h6, trying to take advantage of these dark square weaknesses around black's king. Now, knight from d8 to b7 seems sort of like an odd move to move your knight to a square, which normally that's where your bishop belongs. But this move also has a couple of ideas, which reinforces moving one of his knights to c5, which would then attack this bishop on d3. So bishop to c2. White realized that this was black's idea, and white was able to basically just play a move which doesn't do anything immediately, but just takes away black's ability to create threats. This is also a strong idea that many players use, is just to play waiting moves that, once they understand that one's position can't be improved immediately, they just play moves which take away your ability to create threats. So knight d to c5, we see that this was black's idea, and this also activates his bishop on c8, allowing his bishop to come out. Bishop to a3, so we see that white wants to shift his focus over to the king side. His bishop on a3 served its purpose of creating the threat of capturing the queen, attacking the queen and the rook here. But now this bishop that wasn't doing all that much on a3 anymore is going to shift its focus over to the king side. So knight to d6, and this sort of adds pressure to the e4 pawn here, and also just sort of frees up this bishop to have more options available to go to. Bishop to g5, and now we start seeing why the dark squares sort of become the property of white's control here. So this bishop here does a wonderful job of cutting into black's position, and these dark squares start becoming black's problem, and it's really difficult to find good moves for black. Black is able to at least finally get his knights into play, but now his queen's sort of going to get harassed by white's pieces. Queen to g7. Black would definitely like a queen trade here, and that would alleviate the pressure of his dark square weaknesses. White correctly declines the queen trade. White does not want to trade queens here, wants to maintain the pressure and continue to create weaknesses in black's position. So queen to h4, and this creates a threat of bishop to f6, which would force black's queen to go to probably f8, and black plays a move which immediately defends the f6 square. So now white can't play bishop to f6. But we see now that black's moved his knights so many times, and his bishop on c8 is still undefended. So being able to defend your pieces, or develop your pieces quickly, is also a good idea. Because when you fall too far behind in development, usually it creates weaknesses, and your opponent's allowed to take advantage of those. Bishop to h6. White is attacking black's queen. And we see queen to h8, sort of a comical move. The queen is developed in the corner and really does not do well in such a position. However, it's the only square basically available that doesn't lose immediately. Bishop to a4. So white realized that his bishop needed something to do, realized that black no longer had pressure on the e4 pawn, and plays a move which ties white's bishop down to defending this knight. This knight is now pinned to the rook on e8. This bishop basically wants to defend, or wants to develop, but now that white's played bishop to a4, the bishop is tied down to the defense. f6. Difficult move to explain, but definitely controls the g5 square, so now white can't play bishop to g5. Also sort of just strengthens the center, but we'll see why this is going to become an issue pretty soon. c5, an excellent move to play, and we'll see why this is such an excellent move to play. So this move does a couple of things. This move attacks obviously the knight here, and we'll see why you might think, why can't black just take the pawn immediately with b takes c5? And we'll see why. Okay, so b takes c5. What happens if b takes c5? Well, this creates one issue. This rook here in a corner is completely dead, and we'll see that if white plays bishop to c6, now this rook here is attacked and it's got nowhere to go. And trying to block the attack with bishop to c7 or knight to b7 doesn't work, because white controls the b7 square twice and it's only defended once. So black would end up losing material here in this position if he took on c5. So c5, excellent move, and you might think, what about knight takes c5? Well, the problem with that is it hangs the rook here on e8. So, because remember, the knight is pinned. So c5, and pretty much black plays the only move which is makes any kind of sense. Moving it back to b7, definitely not an option. That's definitely not an option. So knight to f7 is basically the only move. However, we see now that black's king is completely in trouble. This bishop on h6 does a wonderful job of taking advantage of those dark square weaknesses. And f7, knight to f7 attacks the bishop, trying to eliminate the attacker on the king side. But white correctly plays the move which maintains the advantage, bishop to e3. White does not want to trade this bishop here. He wants to definitely keep that dark squared bishop. After all, part of white's attack here is taking advantage of those dark square weaknesses. So if black is allowed to trade off that piece, it would alleviate white's pressure on black's position. And also, bishop to e3 also defends, sort of adds to the defense of the c5 pawn. So now if black is thinking about taking the c5 pawn, we can take back with the c5 pawn, and this idea of bishop to c6 is renewed. So rook to e7, trying to get out of the pin, trying to move this knight somewhere, just basically trying to do anything which doesn't seriously disintegrate black's position. h3, and this is sort of a funny kind of move. The reason why this is funny is because white realizes that almost any move that black plays will make his position much worse. So he just plays h3, sort of a waiting move, just to see what black does, because he realizes that black can't really improve his position at all immediately. Queen to g7, trying to put his queen somewhere more useful than the corner on h8. And we see d6. And the reason why this is because white wants to open up the position, realizes that black's pieces are so far behind in development. Even if he does sacrifice a pawn here, it's definitely well worth it. Also, d6, the idea behind d6 is to open up this diagonal on the king. And we'll see why this becomes important soon. So d6, and we'll see why this becomes important. C takes d6, c takes b6, and what that does, c takes d6, c takes d6, knight takes d6. Now, even though white has given up a pawn here, we see that this bishop is able to come to a much more effective diagonal than being on this one here. Bishop b3 check. Knight to f7. So the knight has to go back to f7 where it was anyways. Bishop to h6. Now the queen is attacked again. Can't go back to f8, and unfortunately has to go back to the h8 square. However, black had this interesting try, instead of trying queen h8 where it was originally, to play g5. Counterattack and attacks. Counterattack. Let's go back. So g5 would have attacked white's queen. Would have been a better try. And we see that after bishop takes g7, g takes h4. White is slightly better. White could probably just move. Hard to say, but because the bishop can't really be saved. It can go to h6. However, black is definitely surviving this position. After the queens come off the board, white is still better, but white's attack has basically been diminished. So g5 would have been an interesting try. However, black decides to put his queen back in the corner, and we'll see how white is able to take advantage of the situation. Rook e to d1. Just putting his other rook on the open file. And we'll see black tries to develop his bishop, finally gets his bishop out, but this ends up being a mistake. Probably better was rook to e8. Just keeping his bishop where it is. Just trying not to do anything at the moment and trying to wait to see how white advances. Bishop to b7, and we'll see why this becomes an issue immediately. Knight to h2. White is able to reroute his knight to the g4 square, where it attacks the f6 pawn, and we'll see that this becomes a favorable tactic for white. So knight to c5. Black is trying to eliminate this beautiful bishop here on b3, which is pinning this knight. But black's plan ends up being a little bit too slow. Also, this move here for black attacks the e4 pawn, obviously. But white's position is so well developed that black's plan ends up being non-effective. Knight to g4, obviously attacking this pawn here. Knight f6 would be check. And then we'll see that this tactic ends up being so strong. So knight takes e4. Black realizing that taking the bishop would be a mistake, so plays knight takes e4, tries to defend the f6 pawn. And white had this interesting try here, actually, taking advantage of this pinned pawn on f6 with knight takes e5. Now the pawn can't take immediately because the queen could capture the rook here on e7. But you'll think, what happens if rook takes e5? Well, rook to d7 creates so many threats that black can't possibly manage to counter all of them. This knight on f7 is still pinned, so it can't capture the bishop. The bishop on b7 is attacked, and the knight on f7 is attacked twice. And the only move which defends this knight on f7 would be rook to f8, but since white already controls that square, white would win the exchange bishop for rook. So what do you think about bishop d5? This does not work. And for the move, queen takes e4, a brilliant move. Now you're thinking, what happens if bishop takes e4? Can't we just win the queen? Yes, we can win the queen, but white actually checkmates black. Bishop f7 check, and the bishop here controls all of the other squares around the king. So bishop d5, queen takes e4. What happens if queen g7? Well, bishop takes d5, rook takes e4, and bishop takes g7. Rook to d4, bishop takes f6, rook takes d5, rook takes d5, and white is actually up a rook. So that would be one option, although white would probably still win that position, but would not checkmate immediately. So we see that white had this interesting try of knight takes e5, which would have been an interesting tactic. But we see white plays this also interesting move, f3, which forces black to move away the defender of the f6 pawn. And after g5, which tries to counterattack, black probably should have tried this a while ago. Now the queen here is under attack. Queen has to move away somewhere. Probably could have moved to h5. That would have been maybe a better choice. But moves back to e1. And then knight back to c5, trying to eliminate that bishop again. But we see rook to d6. Also, again, this rook here does a wonderful job of reinforcing this f6 knight takes f6 idea. And even though black was able to get his knight back to c5, where he's trying to eliminate this pin, all of that becomes unimportant, as we soon see. So knight takes b3. Why doesn't that work? So knight f6. Now the king is in check. And the king cannot move to these squares because it's controlled by the bishop. So queen takes f6 is the only move. Queen takes f6. Rook takes f6. Knight to d4, and white is obviously going to win this position, being up the queen. So after queen e1, knight to c5, rook d6 creates all these threats. Black trying to defend this f6 pawn with knight to d7. But white's pieces are so well coordinated that none of this ends up becoming an issue. And after the move, queen to d2, this attacks the knight on d7. We see that it's only defended once and it's attacked twice. So after bishop to c8, sort of another comical move where black had to finally develop this bishop to the b7 square, only to move it back to the c8 square, the starting square. Pretty actually kind of funny. So after the move, knight takes f6. Basically, this game is all over. Knight f6 check. So why is that all over? Knight f6 check. Queen takes f6. Rook takes f6. And king h8. King h8. Rook takes f7. Rook takes f7. Bishop takes f7. Knight to f8. Queen takes g5. Just completely ignoring the free knight on f8. Bishop to e6. Queen takes e5 is mate. So a very instructive game by white, allowing all of these ideas to come into fruition. Maintaining the pressure on black's position, creating threats, making it difficult for black to develop his pieces, controlling the center, taking advantage of weaknesses around black's king. Overall, a very instructive game. So hopefully you've learned something, and we'll see you next time.